2, Freddy's coming for you. 3, 4, better lock your door. 5, 6, grab your crucifix. Do, 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 do. You guys, that was me. Kylie. If you're a child watching this for some reason, don't try that at home. Don't hobble around like an idiot with a fistful of knives. But I bet you already know what it is. Today is my Nightmare on Elm Street comparison. This has been a long time coming ever since I started this series over a year ago on my channel. And what better way to celebrate the fact that this movie is now in the National Film Registry in the Library of Congress. Only a handful of horror films in history have ever made it there. In fact, this is the full list. These films make it there because they are, quote, culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. And it's honestly no surprise that Wes Craven's classic A Nightmare on Elm Street is now on that list because, of course, it's very culturally significant. Also, what better timing for this video than when Heather Langenkamp is making her big comeback in The Midnight Club. That show is fantastic, by the way. But she has also come out recently and said that she would love to reprise her role as Nancy one last time. I think she said something about how Jamie Lee Curtis has been so inspiring reprising her role as Laurie, and so she wants to face Freddy one more time. Ugh. So the stars have just really aligned for today's video, and here's how I'm breaking things down today. We're gonna start off with the cultural impact, you know, the reception of the films, the box office, and some other just general background information. Next, I'll quickly break down the plots of either movie. What did they shake up for the remake? Then we'll do a character comparison, so which protagonist did you prefer, which villain did a better job at giving us the heebie-jeebies. Then I'll compare the style of either movie, and today will obviously be a big discussion on practical effects versus CGI. After that, we'll talk about the themes in either movie. What arcs did the characters go through? What were we meant to learn? And finally will be the overall comparison, where I kind of tally up the points and we try to decide which is the superior film. So let's kick things off with the original A Nightmare on Elm Street. Directed by the iconic Wes Craven in 1984, this movie had a budget of between $1.1 and $1.8 million and went on to make $57 million in the box office, which may sound like less than you were expecting, but if you adjust that for inflation, that is $162.5 million in 2022. We have so much fun behind the scenes info, and I have actually covered quite a bit of it already during my Wes Craven deep dive. I did a deep dive on his career and kind of his life, but there's much more to cover today, starting with the real life story that inspired A Nightmare on Elm Street in the first place.
The beginning of A Nightmare on Elm Street really came to me with a series of articles in the LA Times about young men who were dying in the middle of nightmares. In this particular case, a young man had a severe nightmare and told his parents, "I can't go back to sleep, I'm going to die, I just know it." And the father was a physician and said, "Let me give you some sleepy pills." The kid didn't sleep the first night, and then in the second night he didn't sleep again, and then it became clear that he was trying to stay awake despite everything. And finally the kid fell asleep, and they took him upstairs and put him to bed, thinking, thank God, that little crisis is over. And in the middle of the night, they heard screams and ran into the room, and he was thrashing on the bed horribly. Literally before they got to him, he fell still and he was dead.
Very eerie story. I guess it's also not the only one of its kind. As far as other inspirations, people also typically wonder why he used Elm Street. When he was a professor, a street on one of the universities that he taught at was called Elm Street. He mentioned that he also wanted to have a very all-American feel to the location. He doesn't ever really elaborate on why this specific setting, but I think it makes more sense once he starts talking about Nancy and how he wanted her to feel like a very true girl next door. But we can also infer that because of the boom of suburban horror thanks to Halloween just 6 years prior, only 3 years prior at the time of him writing the script, that he was definitely following trends as well. Prior to Halloween, you didn't really see horror in suburbia. The main trend of the 50s was sci-fi, and then towards the end of that decade, and especially in the 60s, you saw a lot of upper class horror. They were always set in these really decadent mansions, so in the 70s and 80s, they kind of brought horror to us regular class folk. A Nightmare on Elm Street also brought horror to everyone though, because of the concept of a boogeyman that enters your dreams while you sleep, and everybody sleeps. But what if I told you that Robert Englund was not the original vision for this boogeyman?
Most villains are cast in these kinds of movies are usually stuntmen. Wes's idea was to get a real actor in the role.
I was casting for an old man because that's how Freddy was written. When I was reading older men, there was a softness to them. There was something about having seen, I think, so much of life that there was a certain tenderness to them as far as they couldn't really be evil.
I think that the idea was to have Freddy be even more kind of decrepit and like weird, but they ultimately realized that it didn't even matter how young Robert Englund was because he was going to be covered in prosthetics anyways. He wasn't even the first choice though. Somebody named David Warner was originally cast in the role, but the stars aligned and he dropped out very last minute due to apparently having some scheduling conflicts. Another surprise, Johnny Depp's character Glenn ended up with a whole different look than he had been written to have. He was actually written as a much more conventional jock, and then Glenn ended up being much softer and looked a lot different than how Wes originally envisioned. He met up with Johnny Depp and he grabbed his headshot, and once he got home, he put his headshot along with some others on his kitchen counter. Then his daughter became somewhat smitten with Johnny Depp, and that kind of settled it. Though again, I don't think that you will believe who was in talks to star as Glenn.
Charlie Sheen wanted the role, but he wanted $3,000 a week and we didn't have it.
This would have been a much different movie, I think, if Charlie Sheen had the role. He had a lot more experience than Depp, and I think he would have played it up a lot more how it was originally written. According to Wes, the character became a lot softer because of Depp.
Johnny was so terrified when he was first performing. He would always be in a sort of a cold, clammy sweat, and his hands would be trembling, and he was really pushing himself, into an area that was totally different. I don't think something that he felt prepared for at all.
It makes sense that he was nervous because he got the role basically just based on his devilish good looks. He didn't have any prior experience. I have much more to get into concerning the fun facts behind the characters, but we will wait until our character portion of this video. At this point, we know the franchise is 9 movies deep if you're counting Freddy vs. Jason. Wes Craven had also returned for the 3rd and 7th installments. However, at the time, they were pretty much risking it all to release this movie. Back in the day, New Line Cinema was just a distribution company, and Bob Shaye was a copyright lawyer. They only had about $1 million to throw out this movie, and less than that for the marketing and distribution, and it could have well and truly destroyed the company if it flopped. However, it did remarkably well its opening weekend. It opened to 165 theaters and made about $1 million. New Line Cinema is now nicknamed the house that Freddy built because they would not have seen the success that they have at this point without A Nightmare on Elm Street. Immediately there was demand for a sequel, and then another, and then another, and the rest is history until somehow in 2010 we found ourselves getting a highly contentious remake. Because of the success that they knew would come from using the A Nightmare on Elm Street title, they threw $35 million at this movie. Not for nothing, the movie then went on to make $117 million. If you've been following this series on my channel for a while, you are very aware of 2 men named Michael Bay and Brad Fuller. They were the crew behind the Friday the 13th, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Amityville horror remakes as well. So naturally, after the success of those films, they wanted to tackle yet another classic. Samuel Bayers directed this movie, and he was offered the position 3 times. He declined it the first 2 times and only accepted the 3rd time because Michael Bay basically promised him monetary success. So we begin to see the threads of why this was not going to be the most well-liked remake. Right off the bat, the director did not accept the project until the 3rd try when he knew he'd make a lot of money. On this note, the man Wes Craven himself was not consulted at all for this project. Using the Wayback Machine, I found this old interview from an article where he says he feels genuinely hurt by the project. He goes on to say he signed all the rights away, unlike Last House on the Left, in which he was able to kind of shepherd the remake. It was even painful for him to think about because A Nightmare on Elm Street is the film of his that he loved the most. Bless him. In contrast, Robert Englund actually felt like it was time for a remake, and he was excited about Jackie Earle Haley stepping into the role.
I think he's a very interesting choice. Jackie's got that wiry build, and I always thought of Freddy as kind of like a junkyard dog, and I think part of Jackie's energy kind of brings that to the role, and he's the real thing. Jackie's got real serious chops. I've been a fan of his since a film called Breaking Away, and I thought he was the best thing in Watchmen.
And of course, we will have a lot to get into comparing the Freddys later on, so just hang tight for that. What may surprise you, though, is that even though the intentions for the director signing on to this project were less than ideal, he seemed to have a good amount of care for it.
I certainly recognize how many diehard fans there are out there. I've kept them in mind. I think we all have. The studio and myself, the producers, when we made the movie. We made the movie for them as much as we've made it for a new audience.
What do you think, lads? Do we believe him? I mean, I do think that they kept fans in mind at the very least because there are so many references to the original in this remake. A girl gets sucked up to the ceiling and Nancy sees her friend in a body bag. A claw comes out of the bathtub. The boiler room is also a really prominent location, but to me it doesn't really feel like paying homage. It kind of just feels like ripping scenes off from the original. A lot lot of fans felt similarly, and this movie has been ripped to shreds by fans and critics alike. It had a very large and monetarily successful release, though. It released to 3,300 theaters and to over 5,000 screens. Like I said, it made over $100 million, but it currently sits at a 15% on Rotten Tomatoes with 184 critic reviews. It also has over 100,000 audience reviews at an abysmal 43%. Similarly, on Letterboxd, it's been reviewed about 117,000 times, and it has an average rating of 2.1 out of 5. For a good majority of fans, it falls dead last in their rankings. A lot of them also do not claim its existence. But there are some of us out here who are not blinded by hatred or nostalgia that have the ability to kind of point out a few things the film did well. So on that note, let's get into the plots, shall we? The original Nightmare on Elm Street seems to be following Tina as she struggles with her nightmares of Freddy Krueger. In a psycho-like twist, she is killed, and we follow Nancy as she tries to save her other friends from the same fate. After she learns her parents and others killed Freddy after learning he assaulted and killed their children, Nancy has one last battle with Freddy, coming out victorious. Or so she thought. In the remake, we follow Chris after her friend Dean seems to kill himself in a local diner. She and others begin experiencing the shared nightmare of Freddy Krueger before she is gruesomely murdered. We then follow Nancy and Quentin as they uncover the horrific assaults they experienced as children and track down Freddy in his lair. In one last battle, the couple emerges victorious, or so they think. When you put it like that, really truncated, they're pretty much the exact same story. The remake didn't really change much. Chris has the exact same plot progression as Tina, so they just kind of changed the names to throw us off, I think. Chris is also going through a breakup with her boyfriend, which is kind of another layer of drama, but then he goes through the same exact progression as the original again, where he is committed for murder and then dies in jail. The only outright differences really between the original and remake are with the characters and some unsavory subject matter. So I'll save the character talk and get into one of the fans' least favorite plot lines of this movie. Basically, with the original, Freddy was still a sexually motivated killer, but they kept that subject matter extremely implicit, as they should. It wasn't always going to be that way either, but during pre-production development, there was a news story that broke about a big group of children that were accusing one of their teachers of touching them inappropriately. So they scaled it back, which in Wes Craven's own opinion too, he thought was for the best. I also always prefer more implicit dealings with real-world horror, so in the remake, they decided to bring that subject matter a lot more front and center, which is also why the movie is given a much darker tone.
Very purposefully, we've lifted parts from the original movie to pay homage to it. There are elements that have been fleshed out and thought of very differently from the original movie. And telling an origin story was very interesting to us, and I'm not so sure it was ever dealt with in the way that we've dealt with it, kind of a realistic, disturbing way. It's one of the things I'm proudest of is the going back into Freddy's past and seeing how he became Freddy Krueger.
I can at least appreciate the change in tone because I don't feel like it's taken as seriously in the original. I feel they can get away with that in the original though, because it is so implicit that they just don't want to touch it. But in the remake, they're really out here being super obvious about the fact that Freddy is experiencing like sexual pleasure while torturing these children.
This dress was always one of my favorites.
Like, it's really quite nasty. That is largely one of the most hated things about the remake, and I understand, I agree. However, I think that if the original movies did not exist, it probably wouldn't be as big of a critique. If you're gonna have a sexually motivated killer, you better make that dark. That's really serious real-world shit. I think if the movie didn't have all the baggage of being a remake and having really bad CGI, people may have just viewed it as a really average critique on rape culture and trauma. I'll save that chat for the theme portion of the video though. Next, I just want to briefly go over the concept of micronaps. This was one of the only areas where I feel like the remake improved on the original, because in the original, Nancy does do a sleep study, but we don't really learn much more than that other than it is critical to dream. Everyone needs to dream. In the remake, they go into the science of micronaps and they play around a lot more with slipping into your dreams whilst being awake. I thought that was super cool and made for some really interesting filmmaking. Speaking of interesting filmmaking, I'll wrap up the plot portion of today's video by talking about the ending of either film. Don't like them. I'd like the original so much more if it didn't have that dumbass ending, and that wasn't even the original ending. It was supposed to end after Nancy turned her back on Freddy, which would have made so much more sense.
We were uncertain about the ending. Wes wanted the ending to be that Heather woke up in the morning and the sun was shining and she walked away.
He wanted to have a big hook so that he could have a sequel, and I thought he was crazy that there would never be a sequel. Boy, was I stupid.
I just felt that the ending to the movie didn't send the audience out with any great excitement.
And he and I had lots of arguments.
I even think my father got involved. They were asking his opinion.
If it wasn't for Bob Shea and the pressure to set up a sequel and copping out, then the movie's ending would have made sense. So in my headcanon, that last dream doesn't happen. For some reason, they kept that kind of ending for the remake, and it's worse. It's so much worse. It's really implied that Nancy has made it home just fine, like she's not dreaming or anything, and then blammo, mirror scare. It's one of the worst CGI moments, for sure. That'll do for plot, though. There is now plenty to get into with our characters. Gonna kick things off with our side characters because I have to. At every opportunity I get, I have to throw love at a one Katie Cassidy. It's what she deserves. There's nothing wrong with her or Tina. I think they're both great, but Katie Cassidy feels like the missed opportunity of the century in my opinion. She is a scream queen. She is final girl material. Like, she should have been the final girl in this film. I know my subs have told me that she's done a lot of TV. I think she stars in Supernatural, but she should have been the Jenna Ortega of the early 2000s, if we're being honest. I think it would have been a cool subversion to the original if they ended up killing off Nancy and they made Chris the lead. They also make this girl scream in this movie. I think that honestly might be the main reason why I have a preference for her over Tina, but again, nothing wrong with Tina, love the girl. And then we have a definite upgrade from Glenn to Quentin. Here we go. Glenn had quite literally one job. Don't fall asleep, Glenn. And what does he do? What does this lad do? Useless, useless little man. Quentin was the complete opposite, completely proactive, completely willing to stab a syringe into Nancy's heart. I think this was a necessary change though, because Nancy was such a nothing character in the remake. The whole point with her character is that she was a tortured soul.
Yeah, I mean, our Nancy is completely different, and I think that sort of came from the fact that our movie is so much darker and that we added a lot of backstory, and so because of that we had to make the character different. Sam likes to call our Nancy the loneliest girl in the world.
I don't know if you've noticed, but I don't exactly fit in.
In case you haven't noticed, I'm weird. I'm a weirdo. I don't fit in.
My problem with this is that it makes her completely one-dimensional when Heather Langenkamp's Nancy was so well-rounded. The only emotion you ever see from remake Nancy is reservation and then fear. She's so in her own world, which we see when she's ever like doing her artwork or talking to people. And that's fine, but I don't like when women are written so that their only character trait is, I'm traumatized. Men have a really bad habit of writing women that way. See the absolute flop that was Men 2022 for an example? I always thought, oh, Rooney Mara, she's just so disinterested in the role. But no, she was like intentionally written terribly. When it comes to Craven's Nancy though, I mean, what can I say about this girl? She commands every single conversation she takes part in. Glenn just wants to get laid, and Nancy is like, we're here for our friend, not our own mortal pleasures, bitch. Her mother is like, forget it, Nancy, he's dead, and she's like, face the truth and stop drinking, bitch. Freddie comes for her and she goes, not today, Home Alone traps, bitch. I don't know why it's taken me so long to fully appreciate Nancy. Like, I don't know what's wrong with me. I put her so low in my Final Girls ranking list, and now I'm like, no, top 10. See how you can make a girl with childhood trauma, como se dice, multifaceted, interesting. More favorite Nancy moments, she tells off a cop.
Everything is gonna be alright! Everything's under control! Get my back, you asshole!
She also owns her own power and takes back all the energy that she gave to Freddie. Beautiful. My favorite parts of the movie are whenever Nancy is telling someone off, which is pretty often.
And what did you do, you shit? You fell asleep.
So I do get the intent of trying to change it up, focus more on her trauma, kind of make her a loner, do more of a character study, but that's not what the remake was. Heather also felt like there was so much of herself in Nancy, and I think it's because she was just written well.
I never felt like, oh gosh, I really need to take a lot of time and develop a character. I really felt like I was going to bring myself to the set and be as close to me as I could.
I think Freddie considered her a worthy adversary, but she also has to be the one to go. She's like his penultimate, if not ultimate, challenge.
I had never considered the fact that Freddie was drawing things out because he saw Nancy as a worthy adversary. I never really looked beyond the fact that he was only keeping her awake long enough so that when she did fall asleep, she wouldn't wake up. But I think it's true, they're almost the mirror image of one another, just completely opposite forces of light and dark. Poetry. Speaking of a one Fredward Krueger, let's compare our bad boys.
He just relished being evil, and it brought out that wonderful thing about Freddie of, it's the guy on the sidewalk frightening the kid, but he also was able to do it in almost a funny way.
It's funny because a lot of creature actors are some of the nicest people that you will ever meet, and Robert Englund is no different, but he's also like, ugh, I love being evil. It was absolutely not without its challenges for him though, because that man, well, both of them went through hell for their makeup. The makeup artist on the original film was David Miller, who had just gotten off of a little music production called Michael Jackson's Thriller. The way he came up with Freddy's look, by the way, you're not gonna believe it.
I was at a restaurant one night and I was having pizza and I was just kind of deep in thought. I started playing around with the cheese, putting it around the pepperoni, and I actually made Freddy's face on the pizza.
Pizza. Un pizza. The fuck was that? But it was really, really tough working in that makeup, and apparently some days by the end of the shoot, he would just start ripping the pieces of the prosthetics off. But that's a thing that happens to a lot of actors in prosthetics. They go latex crazy, and so then they have the compulsion to literally rip it off of them. For the rest of Freddy's look, they also put these kind of uneven shoulder pads on him that made him lopsided and affected his posture, so that also influenced the movements of his character. He just kind of leaned into the weirdness of the pads, which I think is cool. He says he was also inspired by Nosferatu, specifically with how he used his claw. As far as the iconic sweater, which I don with honor today, you might have wondered why red and green. Or maybe not, I don't know what happens in that noggin of yours.
And the red and the green together actually were from an article on how the eye and the retina deal with color, and those two colors were very difficult for the eye to see side by side, so I said, great, that'll be the stripes of the sweater.
So f*** Christmas, am I right? Unfortunately, I don't have much behind the scenes information on the remake just in general. There are plenty of interviews, but most of the interviewers just ask the same question because of course everybody wants to know, how did it feel stepping into this iconic role? And Jackie Earle Haley had a lot of enthusiasm about it too.
It's really scary kind of stepping into Robert's glove. I mean, the guy has done a phenomenal job of playing this character over the decades, and he's kind of synonymous with the character. And that's what's daunting, is to try to play a character that people already have something different in mind or someone else in mind. It was still more exciting than it was daunting, because it's like, you know, how can you not play Freddy Krueger?
He really recognized that he had huge shoes to fill, or a glove rather. He took a lot of care with the role, and I love to see that he and Robert Englund both have a lot of mutual respect for one another, as they should, because they both brought something really different to the role. He did a lot trying to get into character. He started by researching various real-life serial killers like Ed Kemper. But then he kind of realized he was the wrong path going down that route, because Freddy is not a typical serial killer. He is a boogeyman in a campfire story. That's just a completely different energy to inhabit. It also seems to have affected his psyche slightly.
Every now and then, it's like when I completely shave like everything off, and I've walked past a reflective surface, it through my peripheral thought I saw Freddy. It's like I had to do it. No, it's me. Okay, good. That's messed up, isn't it?
A lot of other actors have faced a lot worse playing real-life serial killers. Now Ross Lynch and Evan Peters have both played Jeffrey Dahmer at this point. So it's not unheard of for this kind of a role to stay with an actor, and Jackie Earle Haley really tried to become Freddy. For some reason, the claw they used in the remake was also not just a clip-on, it was kind of a complicated process securing it, so once it was on, it was on.
It became second nature. I would also take it home and kind of wear it around the house. I'd practice with it and also wear it while I was just doing normal things, just to get it to where I'm not thinking about the glove. It's just second nature.
He really did his homework, and that's something I can respect. I love hearing an actor's process when it actually makes sense and it's not just some made-up pretentious nonsense. I'll also be very honest with you, I find his Freddy to be a lot more scary. I think it's because it feels a lot more grounded in reality, and of course because the motivations feel a lot more sexual. Being assaulted is literally my biggest and my most rational fear, so that's why it's so effective for me. But what about the makeup? He looks so stupid. Bring a new thought to the table. When you've watched the remake enough, you become desensitized to the naked mole rat vibes, like you get used to it. The same thing happened to me with the Child's Play remake. Like, yeah, it's ugly, but it's not as distracting anymore. Not to mention, even if a man looks stupid, I wouldn't be any less terrified if he was coming at me like that. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy Robert Englund's Freddy far more, but I am not scared of him. I think a lot of that comes down to style, so shall we discuss the style in either film? We kind of already have. The original is very campy 80s fun, and the remake is much darker and more serious. Of course, the biggest stylistic difference is probably the effects. I think one of the biggest examples is how they shot Tina and Glenn's death versus how they shot Chrissy's death in the remake. This was an insane story of shooting this scene because they built a rotating set a la Poltergeist. Apparently with Glenn's death scene too, when they poured down the water, it hit the light in the bedroom and it electrified the water. So the poor effects man was being electrocuted and something went wonky with the rig, and so everybody was jumping out of it it and getting covered in the fake blood. Mind you, with a shot like that, you only get 1, maybe 2 takes, so it's a very impressive feat if you can pull it off. Also, fun fact with Glenn's death, there was an alternate take where his body came back up out of the bed. But to shoot those scenes, a lot of the crew ended up getting really nauseous from being upside down so long. Amanda Weiss suffered really bad vertigo, but the effect was obviously worth it. That poor girl also went through it. There was no zipper on the body bag for the body bag scene, and so she was kind of left to the mercy of the crew. But anyway, in the remake, it looks to me like they just had her on a wire and were banging the stunt double around the room to a much goofier effect. Of course, I must also discuss the iconic shot of Freddy coming through the wall. I actually found a really cool behind the scenes clip where you can hear Wes calling out the actions.
And fold. Hands. And Nancy stirs. Freddy starts to go back. And Nancy looks at the ceiling.
I just wanted to show that because even with no music, the illusion kind of being shattered with Wes calling out the direction, you can hear the crew shuffling around, it's still a very eerie effect. In the remake, it's a bit of a different story. I'll wave the white flag. I don't have any excuses for that. The CGI was a choice, if nothing else. At times, I actually do think it's really serviceable when the kids are having these micro naps. It's a bit too dramatic in the school scene, but it's still a pretty sweet effect. Where I love it the most is when Nancy is in the market and we're halfway seeing the market and the boiler room with this shadowy figure coming in. I like this a lot because it feels more accurate to how we slip into dreams. There's no beginning and end to a dream, you're just awake until you're not, and then suddenly you're dropping acid with a young Mads Mikkelsen on the beach. Yes, that's a dream I've actually had, and yes, I was devastated when I woke up. I don't want to talk about it. Stop staring at me. I don't think I need to point out every practical versus CGI effect. I think you get the idea. I will say, with the remake, I do think the lighting is beautiful. The movie starts very, very strong with our Twilight boy Kellen Lutz unaliving himself in the diner. It's a very intense scene. But the lighting though, this whole opening sequence, it's so good. I also love the switch to red and green lighting to signify that he's dreaming, and just the stylistic flares are incredible. As far as style goes though, that's pretty much where my praises end for the remake. I much prefer the campiness of the original. So at this point, there's nowhere left for us to turn but to discuss the themes of either movie. The original is kind of all about exposing the dark underbelly of suburbia. Again, if you saw my breakdown of Wes Craven's life and career, then you would know that he grew up in a devoutly religious household. He also had a very abusive and absent father who passed away when he was only 4. The parents in the original Nightmare on Elm Street seem to be well-intentioned, but they're also both very absent in their own ways. Nancy's mom turns to a bottle, her dad kind of dives into his work, showing that no matter what your picket fence looks like, there can be some shitty parenting going on. In fact, it's almost more dangerous in how looks can be deceiving, which he actually explores more, I think, in The People Under the Stairs. But the stupid ending ultimately kind of detracts from the overall message, which I take to be, standing up to your abuser. The conversation is obviously a lot more complex and nuanced than this, but sometimes we do give people the power to hurt us. Speaking from my own experience, I dated someone briefly that when we broke up, they took it really hard and we unfollowed each other on all social medias. I ended up blocking them on iMessage, but they would still actively go on my profiles every single day to watch my Instagram stories. For the longest time, I was like, I don't want them to know that I know. I don't want to block them and have them try to reach out to me another way to ask why. I had blocked their number at this point. I wanted nothing to do with this person. And I saw their name yet again, and it finally scared me that we had been broken up for about 5 months at that time, and they were still actively stalking me. Choosing to search me up every single day just to see what I'm doing. So I finally blocked them, and what do? They send a text message to my mother. I don't know why I'm using they, them pronouns. This was a man. I could see it was tugging at my mom's heartstrings a bit, and I was like, absolutely not. And I had to tell her about what he'd been doing. And she was like, oh, ew, yeah, he needs to get over you. I was in my Nancy era, denying him access to me, taking my power back, and since then I've felt a lot better. There just comes a point when you have to confront the thing, and Nancy understood that. Every situation can't be like that, obviously, but Nancy kind of teaches us the importance of who we allow to have access to us. Make sure that you protect your energy, babes. It has a really profound effect on your mental health. As far as the remake goes, it has nothing like that of the sort. The confrontation between Nancy and Freddy in the remake seems to be more about getting Freddy to look at what he's done, which is completely futile and strange. It also kind of exemplifies how reclusive people can become after having childhood trauma, how something happening in your childhood can completely reshape who you grow up to be. It's a much more cynical take, but then with Quentin coming into her life, it kind of shows the beauty of, well, you don't have to be alone. I think that sort of speaks to the benefits of group therapy, AA, things like that. Confronting your demons, so to speak, and knowing that you don't have to go through it alone because, you know, dealing with trauma, that's just a human experience. But I really hesitate to give the remake that much credit because it doesn't take the time to explore that. And it makes all the characters extremely one note, so I was definitely reaching with all the AA stuff. It could have been a lot more layered if the movie wasn't so focused on aesthetic, but I do love the aesthetic of it. But it's a lot of jump scares and low-hanging fruit in terms of Freddy coming onto the kids. Things felt done more for shock value than anything else. And I think that really sums up the remake. So it looks like it's about time to determine which is the superior film. Because I've seen these both numerous times, I like to talk about my rewatch experience when comparing them. With the original, I love it more and more every single time I watch it. I love it so much. There are new things to pick up on every single time, and so many iconic moments that don't get old no matter how many times you see it, like all the booby traps. With the remake, I grow increasingly frustrated at the wasted potential that is Chris. And the scares don't get old, but it's in the sense that I want to vomit every time I hear Freddy say, "I'm your boyfriend now." But I'm not a hater of the remake. I do tend to genuinely enjoy myself when I watch it. As far as plots go, I do have a preference for the original just based on the more implicit subject matter. As far as characters go, I prefer the original Nancy, and I have a lot more fun watching Robert Englund's Freddy. However, I find remake Freddy to be more frightening, so do with that what you will. I do prefer Quentin over Glenn and Chris over Tina, so ooh. Nancy kind of outweighs all of them, so I am gonna say that I prefer the characters of the original, especially because they feel a lot more like real people. As far as style goes, oh babes, I'm torn. I love the lighting of the remake, but the CGI, oh no. The practical effects take the cake in the original, they have to. Plus I prefer camp, I'm just not into the heavy tones surrounding sexual assault. They made the right choice toning it down, it's commendable, but it's tough to watch sometimes. As far as themes go, it all comes back to Nancy, doesn't it? The remake doesn't do as much for me, whereas with the original, I walk out feeling empowered just as a human being. So let's stack it up, do some math, if you will. I know about 1,000 gay people just panicked when I said that, but relax, it's just simple addition. In terms of plot, the original wins, and with the characters, it's kind of a tie, but I do lean more towards the original. The style is also remarkably close, but yet again, gotta lean closer to Wes's original vision. And as far as theme, you already know. That ended up being very, very simple math, as we have a sweeping win for the original. Yes, yes. But I'd love to know if you came to the same conclusion. Let me know what movie you prefer down below and let me know why. I also highly encourage you not to list one of the reasons, as Freddy looks stupid in the remake. I know you have an original thought in that noggin of yours and I want to hear it. But you know, hey, live your truth. It's time to thank my patrons though. Yes, a round of applause for these amazing people. If you'd like to get 4 to 6 bonus videos every single month, then go ahead and sign up. That'll be linked down below. Seriously, all the content that I produce on this channel would not be possible without these people, so thank you so much for your continued support. If that's not for you, then all the rest of my social media is listed down below as well. Go crazy, have fun. Click subscribe, the notification bell, that way you never miss another video from me. It also really helps me out, and clicking that like button. And please let me know what comparison that you would like to see next. I have some really fun ones planned, but maybe there's one I haven't thought of. I hope that you enjoyed this comparison. Never trust a pretty boy like Glenn, and I hope I catch you in the next one. Bye!
God, I look 20 years old.